So the first thing I'm going to do, I am going to stick with the same colour thread for my undercollar. Hopefully with this we should be okay. We should be okay with the same colour thread. So let's take our pins out. Now there's two different sides to this undercollar fabric. One's a bit like a brushed cotton, which is a lot softer in colour. Can you see how vibrant that colour is? And then if I just move this other piece to the side, can you see how that's a little bit more muted? I think you can kind of see. I'm going to work with the bright side as being my outside, so that's going to be my right side. So I want right sides together so that I can sew that down. So I've just changed mine round. And then I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance across that extra there, so it's just across that top bit there. So it's not that small edge, it's that thicker edge. And this fabric is going to hold on to itself very nicely, but if you want to, just pop a couple of pins in just on that edge just to hold it together. We're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just move my needle across again. Stitches forward and back, needle in the work. And then reverse stitches at the end here. Needle out of the work. Okay. I'm just going to finger press this open. And because I matched those lines up, we've got a nice match going across the back of our neck, but that's not essential, so don't worry about that. Okay, so now we're going to take our two fur pieces and we're going to put those right sides together. Just make sure that you smooth your fur down and inside, because you want that fur to be inside there. You don't want your fibres to be poking out of your seam. And really, do you know what, I am going to change my thread because I think that it might just show. So just let me just change my thread. I'm going to choose a black thread just to stitch this together, because I just think that it would be such a shame to not have that kind of, and I know the fibres of the fur are going to, right, I'm going to try it. I'm going to try it so you don't have to, and then at the end we can decide whether or not I should have changed my threads or not. So again, with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, couple of stitches forward, couple back, needle in the work, oops, that way, and then stitch across this edge. And then reverse at the end again. Let's have a look. What's the verdict, folks? So it doesn't take long to change the thread, does it? But when you're in the middle of sewing, you sort of kind of want to keep it. So let's just fold that like that. And what I think I'm going to do is, can you see how we've got those shorter fibres in the middle there? I'm just going to try just pulling some of those through the seam so that it kind of pulls them out of the way and through to the inside. I know that feels a bit counterintuitive, but let me just see if it works. No, it's not really doing much difference, is it? So you're going to get a join at the back there where your fur goes one way and then goes the other. But I think in the scheme of things, it's not going to look too bad. I was just seeing if I could just kind of pull some of that out so that it just sort of flowed quite nicely from one to the other. I'm playing. And I know you're sitting there patiently watching for the next step while I'm just having a go. Perhaps helped it sit a little bit flatter, but it's not essential. Doesn't really help much, so don't worry about that bit. Okay, so we've got our collar and we've got our undercollar, and as we know, our undercollar is slightly smaller, and that's so that it pulls the fabric slightly round. So the first thing we're going to do now is, we've got this seam allowance here just open. I think I might... No, we're going to leave it. Right, okay, so we're going to put the right sides together and we're going to match first at that seam there that we've done, where we joined both the undercollar, both sides of the undercollar together. So let's put that together. and make sure that you have your pins facing outwards on here so it's easy to see where they are. And then we've got 2 notches in our collar and 2 notches in our under collar. So just smoosh your fur into the inside so that you're not going to be, you're catching as little as possible in that seam. And let's put a pin in that notch just there. And let's go over to the other side as well and do the same thing. So smooth that fur down and match those, that point there. And we're going to sew all the way around the outside edge. Let me just have a quick look and just see if she wants to sew. No, so we're going to sew around the outside edge first, and then let's come down to the end here. Let's get our match points made first. So right down to the very end, and here you're going to need to get your fur fibres folding inside because you want as much of that to be able to pull out when you finish sewing. It's a bit like with sewing with the festive friends and the fur on was it on Florin's jacket, wasn't it? If you're interested in making those, then just remember I've got videos for how to make all 3 of the festive friends by Luna Lapin on my website, not on my website, on my YouTube channel already. If you've worked with this fur, then you'll have no problem working with Florin's fur. Just keep tucking that fur in, and if you've got your awl, you can use that as well, just to fold that fur in. You want it kind of out of the way of your seam because we want to be able to fluff all that out to hide the sewn line once we've finished. Let's just push all of that in again and put a pin on. Plenty of pins again, but it's just going to hold everything all nicely together for us. And let's come to the other side as well. Let's push all of that fur inside. And especially down the bottom here, you can see where you've got the overhang of the fur. That absolutely needs to be pushed inside. Smooth it back with your finger and then join up your edges of your fabric. Put a pin in quick. And then if you just use your awl, you can just fold that fur back inside for a little way and put your pin in. And again, because you've got all this lovely fur and these lovely fibres, we want to preserve as much of that for the edge of the coat as we can, don't we? So it all wants to pop out. Just smooth it all in. This is why I like to show you sometimes how long it takes to do things, because if I just sort of said, ta-da, I've done it, you wouldn't know how long it took me to push all this in. And look at all those pins as well, but worth it, I think. Okay, and I am going to stay with my burgundy thread because you're not going to see it, so you don't need to change your thread colour, everything's all good. Just make sure those fibres are out of the way. I've got my brush cotton down my... Can you see that way? Yes, you can see that way, can't you? And I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. A few stitches forwards, a few stitches back, and then needle in the work before we take out our pin. I'm going to use my awl as well just to hold everything down in place. And then I'm just anchoring down the fabric with my hand here just to hold that in place while we just go around this curve. And everything seems to be staying in place quite nicely. Just sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Getting around to the thicker part at the back of the jacket, which is where it's all going, the back of the collar where it's all going to be nice. Just keep everything all nice and pressed down with your awl. 2/4 minute seam allowance, because we want everything to be all nice and even on both sides. First, just pushing out just there. Let me just push that back in. Keep those sides together. Not too fast. And then let's just reverse at the end. Starting and stopping threads off. And now what we're going to do then is we're going to fold this round to the right way round. And what I will do is just take my awl and just fluff up this fur on the edge. And can you see where the fur's got caught into the seam just there? If you just move your awl along the edge there and you're just pulling it all out, all of those fibres as close as you can to that stitching line, and it'll just, again there, look, you'll just see it all start to pull out of the seam and come onto the right side of your jacket, or your collar should I say, all nicely. I had to do a lot of this when we're making florin. Just take a little bit of time, but can you see how that's just coming over the edge of the jacket now? So there it's quite a short edge, but if we can pull that fur, those fur fibres out of that seam, just makes it a bit of a plusher jacket for you, and just makes it just sit more nicely. Hopefully you can see the difference that is making, just to give that a really plush look on that collar. So I'm just going to go all the way around and just pull these fibres out. So if I turn it onto the right side, can you see how that gives a lovely roll on the outside? Whereas this side, where I've not done it, just a bit shorter. I don't know if you can see. So for me, I think it's worth it, but it's up to you. You don't need to do this if you don't want to. As I say, I do think it just helps give it that lovely look. Okay, so I'm going to carry on doing that, and then when I've done that, I'm going to then match up on the under collar this under seam here in the middle of there and put a pin in, because you're going to pull the under collar slightly further forward so it gives a nice rolled edge, so you won't see any of the tartan on the outside of your coat because it's pulling it forward. We're going to match up the raw edges of the tartan to the fur, and then we're going to run a row of basting stitches just along there, just to hold all of that together. And just there, and then just on the very edge there as well, just fold that in so you can catch that down too, like that. Little pin in the middle there, I think. And then I'm going to do the same on this other side here as well, and just pin that down so that that's all holding everything in together. Just so that when you attach your collar, you don't lose part of your lining, you catch it all in together when you sew it on. So that's there. Do another bit just here. And then just tuck those edges in so you've got a nice end to your collar just there as well. Okay. And then that's going to give us a lovely collar then. So whilst I'm sewing, I will be folding this fur back as far as I can do, but I will go back again and just pull it out of that seam when I'm actually sewing, when I've actually sewn it, so that we get the lovely edge to the collar again that we've had on this side, and especially at this back centre point. We can just tidy all of that up. Okay, I'm going to just get the, oh, shall I get the fur? Yeah, I'm going to get this fur out first. It's very rewarding doing this, and then I'll come back to you when we're going to sew that edge. Okay, so let's sew this collar then now. I've finished faffing. I'm going to use my awl just to make sure that all goes down and under there. Alright, okay, I know what the problem is. Right, it doesn't like you sewing with the fur side down. So we have to turn it over and sew with the fur side up. I'd forgotten that bit. That's why you've not got a double-sided collar, because the fur doesn't like being against the feed dogs, or the feed dogs don't like having the fur. So I'm just going to pull my fur fibres away under the presser foot and just show the mesh edge, and I'm just sewing at about a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's not at the full 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because we don't want those stitches to show. Pins out. This is where an awl can be really handy, because you can use that just to fold those fibres back. Just to see where you're going. Just catching the fur, edge of the fur down to the edge of the fur, the lining on the red tartan. The fur out of the way as much as I can. There is a little bit of guesstimating going on here as well, because you can't see very well. But as long as you can kind of roughly catch it down, it should be okay. Right, and actually I've gone over one pin because it got pushed in and I couldn't see it. Take the threads off. So yeah, so my seam line is just inside there. Just to hold that down. Okay. So the next thing then we're going to do now is get hold of our outside of our coat, and we're going to lay it with the right side up. Just spread out those edges. Let me just take off that thread there, don't need that. And then this collar is going to lie with the right side down, and you want that centre seam there to match the centre seam, so the centre seam on the centre back of your collar to match on the centre seam on the back of your coat. Let's just pop a pin in just to hold that. And then we're going to then match the front of here, so the front of the corner of your collar down onto the front of the coat. Just lift that up before you pin it, just to make sure you can kind of get that on as much as possible. Just having a quick look at my instructions, just see if that's exactly what needs to happen, and it is. So I've just got a pin right on the edge of there just to hold that nice and steady for me. And then we're matching up the outside edge of the collar, or that edge we've just stitched, to the edge of the neckline here. Because you're wanting to make sure that you're going to catch all of your edges in when you sew that on. So there's one side all stitched on. Not stitched on, pinned on. That's the word I wanted. And then let's go and do the other side. So there we've got that in place there. So now I'm going to take it to the machine. So if I show you from this side, you can probably see better. So we've just pinned the collar onto the edge of the dress, and you've got the fur side up on your collar, so that when you've got the on the right side up of your coat, so that you can see that that's going to sit nicely once that's on there. And your centre seam on your collar wants to match down your centre seam on the back of your coat as well, so that that's sitting nicely too. So just make sure, just take a moment to make sure that that is following that back line just there on that back seam, because that otherwise it'll be slightly skew-iff and you don't want it to be that way. I think I'm going to hand tack this because I think that's going to be tricky to get into the through the machine like that. So let me just get some thread so that you can see as well. And sometimes, you know, I do like to machine based, but I think with this fur, I think we want as few passes through the actual machine itself as possible. So let me just thread this needle, which I can never do when I'm on camera. Never do it quickly anyway. Oh, it has. There we go, we've got it. So I've made sure my thread's nice and long and it's double. Let's just do a quilter's knot at the end just to hold on to that. And it's just, I'm working on the inside of the coat, and I'm just going to put a few stitches in. I'm going to try and keep just inside the seam allowance if I can. So about 1/8 of an inch in, but you need to make sure that you're catching your under collar edge. So make sure you can see the tartan edge of your under collar through here. I'm not worrying too much about the fur because we'll pull that out when we do it. And you want the edge of your fur and the edge of your under collar to be caught by your tacking stitches. That will make sure that those two edges don't peek out, because the last thing you want is to sew your lining, your facing onto your coat and then have a raw edge of your fur sticking out. So just make sure you've got that all right. And as you go round, you can take your pins out. This is just a tacking stitch. You see those on there? Just try not to tack any puckers in, because then that will be difficult to get those out when it comes to when you've actually sewn your jacket together. Pattern piece is getting in the way. This will just be easier than trying. You can try and machine tack it, but I just think sometimes it's easier, as I said. Repeating myself, I'll shush. Apologies. But I'm just trying to stay inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that hopefully makes it easy to get these tacking stitches out at the end. When we get to the end, I'm going to do a double stitch there, just to make sure we hold on to that edge. Okay. Pins out. So there we go, that's our collar stitched onto our back of our coat. We just want to make sure that that's going to be sitting down nicely on the back there, because you don't want to see the back of your collar when that's all down and round. You want it all to be nice and flat. Okay. So let's just lay this out again now, because now what we're going to do now is take our lining piece and we're going to put that right side down, and we're going to first, let's match these corners first on the edge here. So find the corner of your facing piece and line it up perfectly with the corner of your other lining piece. That's on the inside, with your collar sandwiched in between, and let's put a pin on there. Let's go down to the bottom of the hem of this facing piece and get that sort of lined up, because we're going to sew this all in one continuous seam. And if you were fully lining this jacket, you would do this exact same step, but you'd have more fabric off your lining because you'd have a a duplicate of your coat made in lining. A duplicate of the outside of your coat. Hoping that's all making sense to those who are a bit more advanced and who want to fully line this jacket. Coat, not jacket. Okay, so we've just done that front edge first with that point marked on the start of that collar. Now I'm going to go to the other side because I think it's easier to get these bearings first. So again, let's find the other start of the collar here and the other lining piece, and let's match that point at the top of that lining piece there first and put a pin in, then down to the bottom of the coat and put a pin down the bottom down there, and now we can just make sure that's going to all lie nice and flat together, and we can pin that all the way down now. And it's very common on adult wear and children's wear for your front facing on your coat to be the same as the outside fabric, because when it blows open in the wind, you want to have that facing area first before you then see your lining. So you'll see what I mean when we actually get to put this all together. Okay, so long as you've not got a twist in any of your lining now, the next bit that I would now do is go to your shoulder points, because you've got shoulder seams on your facing and you've got a shoulder seam on your actual jacket. So locate your shoulder seam on your on your coat and on your facing piece, and put that so that those two seam lines are exactly on top of each other, and then pop a pin in at that point. It's going to be getting quite thick here, so just, you can't do your little pins anymore. You're going to be quite thick on your pins. And let's just do that other side as well in exactly the same place here. Just fold your fur back if you've got that ability to do that, and put that pin in. Oh, pin's bending. That's not good. And then now on these edges where we've gone up from the front up to the shoulder seam, let's just push that fur in and let's just pin those areas. So if you notice at the moment I've not pinned at the centre back yet, I've done everything else but that area. Just think it's easier to get everything matching up nicely. Go down onto this front bit, and if you get the chance, just push your fur fibres inside. But you want all of those raw edges together so that you can pin that all together. I'm going to use my awl just to tuck in any fibres that I can do. Not very successfully, but we'll see what we can do. And then now where you've got your little notch at the centre back, just make sure that's now matching on the centre back seam of your coat, and pin there with one first. Oops, that pin doesn't, that's a silk pin, I think. That's not strong enough for this velvet. And then I'm going to do one either side of that, because can you see how it's wanting to pull the side seam, the edges apart? Just there, so make sure you've got your raw edges together with your collar in between. So that's right on the edge there, because that's going to be like your guide. If you know you've pinned it right, then when you start to stitch it, it should be right as well. So just pull that facing back so that you've got those lines to get those raw edges together. Okay, lots of pins as you can see, but that's going to give us the best chance of success for sewing this. That's round the back of the neck, the collar comes round here, and then the two side bits are straight. So we're going to start here on one side, we're going to do 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, reverse at the start, all the way down to the front, remembering that we need to pivot at this point here. So don't just sort of smooth it off, you actually need to pivot at this point here where it transitions from being the centre front of the coat and going to around the neckline of the coat. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's start down here. 1/4 inch seam allowance, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then needle in the work. Okay. And the walking foot does make a lot more noise than an ordinary foot. It's just that grabbing mechanism, pulling both sides of the fabric through in one go. So we're coming up towards our point. So I'm just going to get really close before I take that pin out, because I want it to hold it absolutely tightly. And now I'm going to lift my presser foot up, but leave my needle in the work, and I'm going to twist now so I can follow the curve of the neckline. And I am making sure to take that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's very thick, so just take your time. Just take your pins out as you go, just gently. Just make sure your raw edges are together. I'm stopping to take my pins out. Coming up to the shoulder seam, so try taking your pins out at the last minute if you can. Try not to sew over them if you can help it, but you need to leave those pins in for the last minute so the fur can't push the facing and the back of the jacket out of the way. Just twist this round. I've lifted up my presser foot. I'm just twisting round just to keep a curve on the back of the neck. Coming right down to the other side now, to the point. So again, I've got to pin it right at the point, so let's go straight as far as we can to that point. And then I'm going to lift up my presser foot and twist again with the fabric so that I can now follow down the front. Just need one more stitch, and then we can twist down. For some reason one of my fronts seems to be longer than the other, but I'll just even it up at the hem. Reverse at the end. So it's quite a long seam, and as you could see I was having to just concentrate as we just went round. But let's just take our starting and stopping threads off first. So let's try and keep those neat. Then let's have a little look. So that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. I think it'll be okay with the way it's been seen. So let's just try turning these edges out. So we need to clip into these corners, I'm sure we will. So let's take our tacking threads out first, shall we? Let's just take that out. Don't want any little yellow fibres sticking out on our finished garment. And luckily I think for the most part I've managed to avoid, not just there. Just pull that through. So I believe that tacking has helped just hold everything in place without us having to battle getting it through the machine again. Make sure you don't snip any of your stitches when you're taking your tacking threads out. If you do, just go back and just reinforce that section with a new run of stitches. So now we've got those out. Now I'm just going to snip through the neck edge of the facing, just so that will sit straight when we turn it through, and also on the back of the actual jacket itself. So I'm not snipping through the neck edge of the collar, just through the facing and the actual fabric, just to help that sit steady. And just take off, without cutting through any fibres, just take off the point of the edge there where we had our threads, where we got our little change of direction, because that will help that sit nicely. And again here, just cuts out some bulk in that corner when you turn it. Just try not to cut off any fibres of your actual collar itself. Okay. So then we're going to pull on the edges of the collar that go down into the corners. Just make sure this is all going to sit nicely as we turn it through. Let's have a quick look and see how that's all going to go. So your lining could do with, your facing could do with being a little bit thicker, I think. I mean, we can tack it down on that seam edge down onto the shoulder, so you've got your shoulder onto the seam edge, and we'll probably do that after it's been pressed. And you can also tack it down just to the back centre back seam as well. I do like a fully lined jacket, but I think it's just, for a beginner, it will probably be too much. But yeah, we'll improve this as we go through. We're going to move on from this facing because we can't do much with it now until we've actually got our sleeve in, and so getting the sleeve in is the next important thing that we need to do, and we can work on getting this pressed and neatened down. Just pop that to one side for the moment, because I think that we can't really do much more else than that until we've got closer to the finish of the actual garment. So find your sleeve piece, which is your last remaining piece. Just make sure you've got your notch at the centre, at the top, the shoulder point. Pattern pieces out of the way. I'm hiding mine under my book. I don't think I'm getting anything past you though. I think you can see me trying to hide those out of the way. Okay, machine to one side for a minute. Let's get our press mat. Because the first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn up the sleeves on this jacket, on this coat, by 1 centimetre. So again, I like to pin into my press mat, so I just put pins through into my press mat, and that then holds that in place for me. And the pins just help me not burn my fingers. And I tend to press, especially if I'm using a cotton fabric, I tend to press before I zigzag, because it gives the seam a memory, and then if any of your seam edge or your hem edge is turned over when you if any of it gathers up whilst you're actually sewing it, you know where that original seam line was supposed to be. So I can just press this now with my press cloth, just making sure that that's got some memory on it. Let's go on to the other one. So I've got both of them. You can see the pins going into my pressing mat, where I've just turned it under by 1 centimetre. And I'm using plenty of steam to give that a nice pressed edge on there. Just give them a blow. Let it cool down. Oops, it's supposed to have stayed there. Right, take these pins out. because now we can just fold that back to be able to zigzag and then to stitch it down, and we'll know we've got the exact amount that we needed. And if any of it gathers up whilst we're zigzagging, then we're not going to have lost any more than we should have done on that edge. So let's put this out the way. So let's do the zigzag first. I'm going to just fold out that seam allowance. So I'm working on the raw edge. I'm going to take my stitch to my number 8, which is my zigzag, and that should be enough just to go across here. We can do something called chain piecing, is we can feed the next one straight in without cutting our threads first. Just lift up your presser foot, put it under, and go straight from one onto the other. So let's take those threads off, cut it the 2 separate pieces to separate them, and then take that thread off. Now let's go back to a straight stitch, and then I'm going to take my stitch length up to a 3 because we're going to edge stitch this. So let's just pop this down, and look how it's made it curve. So just make sure that you flatten this sleeve out again back to your pressed edge that you had originally. And the edge did want to move, but I've caught it down. Not the neatest hem I've ever done. Velvet for you. It likes to move. Maybe if I pin it in place it might have a bit more success, hey? And I can always undo that other one and redo it, can't I? You get to a certain point of making something and you kind of not want it to be done, but you start to feel like you're racing towards the end. If ever you feel like that, just try and stop, go and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something, and then come back, because you need to not try to race it if you can help it. Because that's when mistakes or your finish is going to go slightly off. A much better edge. Yeah, I'm going to unpick mine and then come back and do that one again, and then I'll meet you back here because I'm not happy with that. Look, it's folding out and it's not straight. So that's because I didn't pin it, whereas on the one that I pinned it went right. So see what I mean? I'm just going to stop, just going to have a drink, just take a break, and then I'll unpick this and I'll come back to you when we're going to talk about putting the sleeves in. Okay, so we've got our 2 sleeves, and if we put these together, because generally on sleeves there is a difference between the front and the back, but if we fold these in half we can see that curve is exactly the same front and back. So there isn't a right and a left sleeve, it's just the 2 that are together, and I have gone back and just done that hem again and I'm much happier with it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is if we sort of fold the collar out of the way and choose whichever side we're going to be working on first, we're going to take our sleeve and turn it upside down so it's right sides together with our jacket, and where that little notch is at the top of the shoulder, we're going to match that up to our seam point at the shoulder seam and pop a pin in. Pop a pin in, it's a bit like a tongue teaser, that isn't it? Then I go down to the edge of the bottom here and I match the underarm point with the underarm point on the sleeve. Match those 2 together. Pop a pin in. And then I'm going to go down to the other side as well, and we're going to pop another pin in at that other underarm point. So we've got three reference points, the 2 underarms and the top of the shoulder all matched in nicely. Then we're just going to smooch our fibres together so that we're pushing the top of got the raw edge of the sleeve against the raw edge of the jacket, of the coat. And we're going to put a pin in. There's a little bit of give in the fabric, So again, remember, just take a little bite of your fabric so that we've got room. So that pin's going to hold it really nice and tight. And these are going to fit in quite nicely. You're going to have quite a few pins. So if you're not happy working with pins or you're working with smaller children, then just take the time just to tack this first, because that will make it easier to work with once you get to the sewing machine. But if you're more confident, then you can just work with the pins, or if you're not frightened of getting prickled. At least this fabric's the right colour, isn't it, if we get prickled with the pins? Or pricked with the pins, should I say. Right, okay, that's going in there. And then I've just got a little raw edge there. So just match it so that your raw edges are together. Just manipulate your fabric so that you can pin that on, because it's that shape that we want. We don't want to lose any of the length of the, you can just use the end of your pin just to pull it down if you need to. So as you can see, that wants to just sort of pull up a bit against the edge of the jacket, but we need to keep that straight. I'm going to have my sleeve flat down because that's all nice and flat, and I've got much more going on the inside of my jacket that I want to control. So can you see that's practically flat on the back there where that sleeve is, but if we come over here, we've got far more places where we might have puckers. So onto our machine. So tack that if you want to. Put your sleeve down against the machine bed, and then we're sort of holding the fabric and the collar. We've got quite a lot of fabric here to hold out of the way. So 1/4 inch seam allowance again. Let's just get ourselves started. Couple of stitches forward, couple of stitches back, and then let's put our needle in our work and take out the first pin. Let's have our awl to hand, because that's going to be really helpful here. And we're going to be using that. So again, I've just moved the fabric now so that we can just get this underarm of this sleeve. And so using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just start to go round. Apologies, my hands are in the way. I'm trying to kind of show you and do at the same time, and that's not always easy. But I think you can see okay. At least this white, it's not white fabric. Okay, so just keep coming round, keep you to your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and just do a few stitches at a time before then you take the time just to manipulate and just to work things through. We will go back and correct anything if it's wrong, so don't worry, just a few stitches at a time. And I'm just using my time just to keep everything nice and neat and tidy, and using the point of my awl just to pull any fabric down and making sure that those raw edges are staying together nicely. Almost onto the top of the shoulder now. They're not very long sleeves, seams, but they're just busy because it's just such a small garment, that's why. So let's we can always lift our presser foot up if we've got a needle in our work, and just press up, just make sure that's all going to sit all nicely on the top of that shoulder. So let's just do a few stitches round there. Next pin out. And then I'm going to lift up my presser foot again, and then I'm going to move some of this facing back now and this collar out of the way, just to give me a nice clear run down this side here. Just make sure that's all nice. Just lift that up again, just make sure that's all down. Lifting this up, lifting the presser foot up to make sure the fabric's all nice and down and straight and flat. Then we're coming around this section just here now. Just take yourself nice and steady. Try and keep to your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to go off to the end and just reverse at the end. Right, let's keep our fingers crossed and see how we've done. Take off our starting threads. So let's have a look on our shoulder first. So I can see that my sleeve is all nice and straight. That line is no puckers there. Now let's turn it round to the right side and let's have a look. And yet we've got no puckers there at all. So I'm happy with the way that sleeve has gone in. All nice and neat. So that once we they've got the collar on, and we do our sleeve, that'll be all nice there. So I'm going to do it exactly the same on the other sleeve in exactly the same way. You don't need to watch me do that. That's all going to be the same. Just keep your collar out of the way whilst you're sewing, and then I'll come back to you and we'll talk about doing the side seams. Before we go on to the side seams, I've just done my second one, and that's gone in okay too. Just make sure there's no puckers on this side. No, there isn't. But if you did have a pucker where you'd either caught a little crease in your, either on your jacket or on your sleeve, so when you looked at it from the outside edge here, you got like a little snag in your fabric, all you need to do is just go to the actual place where you've got your crease, undo the stitch on top of that very pucker, and then a few stitches either side, only 3 or 4. Then just smooth your fibres out so that it's all going to sit nice and smoothly together. And then just start a few stitches in front of where you undid and start your stitches again, and then carry on to a few stitches after, and that will correct that for you. It should, if when you put your fingers on it, it won't lie flat. You know, you just need to go back a few more stitches before you start restitching it. But once you can put your fingers on it and it will lie flat for you, then those fibres should, that fabric should lie in nicely for you when you stitch it again, and it should then just correct it for you. You don't need to reverse stitch so long as you just go straight over the other stitches as before. Right, so once you've done that, then what we're going to do is turn this over. So they're going to have right sides together on your cuff, and let's put your cuff together. Let's get some pins, because the cuff is our first match point. The underarm point is our next match point, so just pull that together until you get those open. And put your pin on that, right where those 2 underarm seams join, and then come down to your hem and match up your hem edges, because that's your 3 match points. You start with your hem, you've got the middle with your underarm, and then you've got your end with your cuff, or whichever way round you want to say it. And then we're just going to match up these side seams now with our pins. And then we're going to sew from the cuff edge all the way down through the underarm point. We're going to pivot right on top of those stitching for the underarm point, and then go all the way down the skirt. So just put in as many pins as you need to feel confident. Shouldn't need to tack it, but if you want to, please go ahead and do that. So that's what mine's looking like. All the pins down there. And then we're just going to stitch that with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Get my threads right. Take out that pin and just reverse. And then needle in the work just so we can now work with it. Coming up to that underarm point, so keep going until you get to where your underarm stitches are, nice and steady. Leave your needle in the work, lift up your presser foot, and then twist your garment so you change in direction. Just make sure there's nothing caught underneath there. Put your presser foot back down again. You can take your pin out now where you are. Roll edges together, and then carry on down the side here with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just remember to reverse at the end. And that's got that down there, and then we have to do a little snip at the underarm up into where we've changed direction. Just do a little snip through your fibres. Ooh, it's quite thick just there, but not through the stitching, because that'll help you just when you come to turn this through. So just turn your sleeve through to the right way round, and you'll see that you're starting to get the end of your jacket. Now, the first thing that I do, one of the things that I do is I don't like to see the seam allowance sticking up on sleeves like that. So I will now just take a couple of moments just to open up that seam allowance. You can just snip it off a little bit, but I think we'll just flatten it down inside the seam there, and I'm just going to go over where my hem is on my stitches and just do a few stitches across, holding that seam allowance down. That's it. If you take your threads off quite nice and neatly. I've got a couple of longer ones, hold on a second. Should almost be invisible on the outside, but then on the inside it just means those seam allowances don't stick up for you when your character is wearing your garment. So just repeat that on the other side, cuff, underarm and hem, and that will then mean that we've got a coat that is all in one piece. And we're just down then to finishing our back, the hem at the back, and putting our bow on and pressing this facing and seeing what kind of a finish we can get with this facing down, because the trouble with polyester threads, fabrics, is that they're lovely to look at, and this velvet is super soft. It really is very tactile, but it does mean that it won't press as nicely flat as a garment that has got cotton in it. So we're just going to have a little look at that and see whether we need to do any understitching or not. And I'll don't worry, I'll tell you what understitching is and we'll do it together. So don't worry about that. So I've just pinned my other one. I'm just going to sew down here, snip in the underarm, and then flatten down that cuff edge, that seam allowance and that cuff edge, and then I'll come back to you. Okay, so we've got our two side seams done, and we can see there's lovely fullness on this coat. Now let's talk facings. Let's work out what we're doing with those, because this needs to be folded over and needs to be pressed, but I think it's going to roll out, so we are going to do some understitching. Whether we go all the way around the collar or not, I don't know. I think I'll just do it on the facing and just round the back. I'm just seeing how well it all wants to sit flat, which isn't very well behind the back of the collar. But certainly these edges here we can certainly work on. And what we do when we're understitching is, see your seam allowance. So let me just get you bearings for you. So see where your collar is, and see where the collar goes into the point just here. You've got your front and your front facing. So the front facing is on the inside of the coat. So that one panel folds back through to the inside of the coat, so that when you're wearing it, if you're walking on an adult or children's clothing, you see the inside of the fabric that you've already got. And if you were lining this then would all be lining inside on the front of here, hiding all of the seam allowances inside. So what I want to do is, so if you find the junction between the front and the front facing here, and you know whether it's right, because the front facing goes round the back of the collar on the inside, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be stitching this seam allowance down to the front facing with a row of stitches. And we want it to be nice and neat from the inside, so we're going to start at this collar point just here, and we're going to go all the way down. Now I'm not going to pin mine because I want, you can, shall we? Well, you can if you want to. Okay, contradict myself, you can if you want to. Just take a little stitch, just a little pin, and just pin that seam allowance just to the facing side, just every now and again. I'll show you a bit of a close-up in a second once I've done it, because that will hopefully stop it from flicking under as you're sewing. And it just gives you a bit of a nicer, crisper edge when you're sewing. We do it a lot on the back neck facings and things like that when we're sewing. So there's my pins, look. And if I go this side, you can see I'm just pinning the seam allowance across to the side that's my facing. You can see the zigzag edge there. And then if I pull my fabric and my face, so I'm pulling the seam allowance across towards this side of my machine with the facing, and I want to get that needle right in on the edge, and we're only sewing on the facing side, we're not sewing on the coat side, we're just sewing on the facing side. So as close as you can get, and I'm going to do a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back, and I'm just catching that seam allowance down. And you're only 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. Just make sure that that's caught right. No, it's not caught right. Hold on a second. I'll show you here. It's not caught the seam allowance right, but it's in the right place for the stitching. So I'm going to undo mine. But so there's the. Hold on a second. So here is the seam line for my seam. So 1/8 of an inch in towards the facing is where I was catching my seam allowance down, but I hadn't got it all up. So I just want to take these stitches out and start again, because in order for it to work properly, you've got to have both of your seam allowances towards that edge. I wonder whether actually it'd be better off sewing from the hem up, because then we can stop, can't we? Let's do that. Let's sew from the hem up. So let me move my needle across. So that it's in the right place. Then I'll follow with the edge of my presser foot down. That's better. That'll be easier, won't it? Right, so you can feel with your finger that you've got your seam allowance to the right, to the side. Try and keep your stitches nice and straight. We don't go over the head of that pin. So I'll just get up as far as I can do into that, where that facing is, by pulling the two sides apart, and then just reverse at the top, just in case we can't get all the way up. It'll be far enough up that it won't matter. Off at the bottom. So that's what it looks like. It's just holding that edge down. It just gives it a nicer, neater edge. So then when we fold it and we press it on that edge, it'll be lovely and smooth. There'll be no stitching line on the front of the garment, but it's just keeping that facing towards the back. So it will just keep it just nice. Let's do the other one as well. So there's the other one. I haven't got quite as high up, but that's okay, because it'll just give us that nice edge when we come to press it. Okay. Let's have a little look, see how we're doing. So everything's looking all right, and still need that back facing to go to sit down, but we'll do some tacking of that just to hold that down at the end when we can. Let's move on to the hem for now, because that's the next bit to do. And what we're going to do is actually we're going to flip the coat over so that we've got the wrong side, so the right side up. We're going to fold the facing back so that that's at the right point, and just make sure that when you fold your facing back, you've got your seam allowance on this edge here that you can see. And I would just put a little pin right at that very point there, just to hold that seam allowance down, because you want all your understitching to be on the inside, so we need that to be on the inside. And let's just follow this along, and then that should end on the same level with the facing. If you were lining this, you could still do the same, but I would just keep your actual lining. I would fold a little bit back on your facing and then just hem your lining a little bit shorter than your coat so that it doesn't show. Or you can bag it out. I'm not sure I'm a big fan of bagging it out, just because it can roll quite easily, drop down and roll quite easily to the inside. So let's just put a pin here. So let me just show you what we've got here, because it's quite a full coat here, isn't it? Oh, look at that lovely rich colour on there. It really looks lovely, doesn't it? So here's the facing. So when I fold this out the right way, you'll see that the seam that's got the collar on it, that has got the understitching on it, is where that's the outside edge of the coat. So the facing where we zigzagged, that's on the inside of the coat. Can you see that? So that's my zigzagged edge, and this is the inside of the coat here. So let's just fold that back again, because then what you're going to do is take some of your tartan bias binding. So I've got about an inch overlap over onto the front of the facing, and I'm going to put a pin in there to hold it. And I've opened it up because you've got a crease line then that you're going to follow with your stitching when you stitch this down. So let's move that pin across. And then you're going to line up the raw edge of the binding with the back, with the bottom of the hem, and just pin that on. All the way along. If you come to a seam allowance, just open it up and just put your binding through on top of that. Just keep going all the way around. It's quite a long hem, but you can do it. There's the centre. Is that centre back? No, that's not centre back yet. Quite a few panels to this dress. This coat. I think because of the way that it looks on the, I've got mine upside down, so I have my coat upside down when I'm pinning mine on, whereas Sarah's showing hers that way. It depends which way feels more comfy for you, but intuitively this just feels better for me, just feels more right. But sometimes it might have been confusing in the book if there was the illustration where it was, the coat was upside down. So you have just got enough bias binding to overlap, look, by your inch on the other side. So just move that pin through the bias binding as well, making sure your raw edges are together. There we go. So if I turn the coat that way, this is the right side up. You can see that bias binding is just all the way around that bottom there. The way I attached it was actually to have the coat upside down with the sleeves towards me, and then I started by folding back my facing first, and then your bias binding overlaps your facing by about, that one's about 1.5 inches, but this side it's about 1 inch. Once you've got your bias binding on there, we're now going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to start here, but we're going to start and sew in that crease there. So you need to sew across here, whatever the crease line is. So what's my crease line? Where's my seam gauge? Just under, so it's about 1/2 inch. So if I wanted to, I could then take my chalk pencil, and at the 1/2 inch mark, I could draw in the line that I'm going to be following to make sure that I hit that correctly. And do the same on the other side, look. If I just measure down after the end of the bias binding, because we're going to want to carry on my 1/2 inch point. That just gives me a line to follow, to run off onto, doesn't it? So that it's nice and even all the way around. Okay. So, start from this side here. Make sure that you're onto your seam edge, not your interfacing edge. That doesn't make sense, does it? Make sure that you want the understitching to be coming to the back. So when you fold, you can't fold where your understitching line is like that. You've got to actually fold on the seam that's going to hold that back. So you've got to get the understitching to hold back. A couple of stitches forward, couple of stitches back. I went off a bit aggressively then, didn't it? And then I'm going to follow my chalk line round till I start to hit my bias binding. And then I can still use my awl. And now I'm following the crease line that I've got on the edge of my bias binding, and I'm following that all the way around the hem of my coat. The reason why we use bias binding is because this hem is curved, and so we want the ability for those fibres to either stretch or to compress in order that we don't get puckers in the lining tape at the end. I'm going off onto this chalk line on the other side. Now when we get to the end, I'm going to reverse stitch again. Needle out of the work, and let's take our threads off, starting and end. Okay. So what we have here then now is that when we then press this and then fold it, we'll be able to press this so that the edge of the hem is neatened and is pulled up into the inside of the garment. Again, I think I'm going to understitch this because I know it will give me a nicer finish. So let's understitch this again. It just helps, you know, anywhere where you've got a fabric that just won't sit nicely. I mean, that one might sit nicely, but I don't want to see the white edge of the bias trim on the bottom of my skirt, of the hem of the coat. So just by understitching, it just means it takes a little bit of the fabric with it when it rolls. I'll show you. If you look at it now, look, if we press that right on the very edge there, you're going to be able to see a bit of the white at some points when Luna's wearing her lovely new coat, and that's what I don't want. So let me just understitch it and see if that helps. So all I'm doing is pulling all of the bias binding down towards the edge of the coat. I'm going to move my needle across slightly, and I'm going to stitch the top of the bias binding. Make sure you've got all of your seam allowance down towards the bias binding. I'm using the edge of my presser foot just to run along the seam edge, the difference between the two fabrics. And I'm just feeling with my finger in front of where the needle is, just to make sure that seam allowance is across to the right side. Doesn't take long, it just is an extra step, so it depends whether you want to do it or not. I'm just taking the threads off. But now when we roll that across, can you see how it sort of takes a bit of the fabric with it so that it gives a much cleaner edge? And you can only see this now when you turn it inside out. So it's just got that little, like, almost like beaded edge of the velvet on the edge. But it just neatens that off. Well, I think it does anyway, much nicer. So you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But then what we're going to do now is just going to snip off these corners just here, close to, but not through the stitch line that we've done, just to take off that bulk out of those corners. And then we're going to then use our finger inside that edge there to then just turn that through, and I'm just going to use a pin just to coax out that point at the bottom of that coat. Just be careful you don't flick out any fibres. You want it as neat as you can get it, because this is a beautiful coat and Luna's going to look stunning in it. So again, do that same thing on the other side. So I do my points first generally, just so I don't forget them. Just be careful with that. And then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, over to the pressing machine, and I'm going to press all of that hem up. So all of this bias tape here, let me just move so I'm on camera. So all of this bias tape here is going to get pressed up. Can you see how it's like gathering up? When you hand sew this down, all of that should all press in nicely into the actual garment, so it kind of eats up that extra circumference that you would otherwise have. So just pull all your bias binding down to the edge. And then my suggestion would be that you hand sew this up. You can machine sew it, but I think that for me would give you a slightly less polished look. But it depends if you can do a little slip stitch just to press that up and just to hold that in place all the way around. It's pretty much almost half a circle, isn't it? Yes, it is half a circle, isn't it, this skirt, by the time you've got all of your pleats in. So I'm going to press this up first, and then I'm going to just pin it so that we can then hand sew this in place. So that will keep that all looking nice, and then I'm going to press it again, and hopefully all the little creases that you'll have on, because of this being a circle skirt, will all start to press out, and you'll get a lovely flat edge to your bias binding. If you do have anywhere, you might have to just put the smallest little tuck in the edge of your tape, just like this, just to eat up some of that extra circumference. And if you have to do that, that's fine, that's totally normal. Just try and do several smaller ones rather than one big one, because if you just do the smallest one, so it takes the edge in on this upper edge but to nothing on the bottom edge, you'll keep the shape of your hem. Whereas if you try and do a bigger one, you're going to end up with several points along the edge of your hem that don't look nice. As I said, when you're actually pressing this up, it might be that you can, the steam helps ease all of that extra circumference in, and you won't need to do any pleats at all. But once you've done that, then just reinstate your pleat on the back of your coat. You've still got your tack lines to show you where that should be. Just reinstate that so that that's all got that nice memory in the back there. And then I'll come back to you. So I'll show you how to do the slip stitch, I think, because some people might not know how to do that. And then we'll then be looking at trying to tidy up this inside, which is just not, I mean, it's going to be fine once it's on, Luna, because we can tuck it in, but we can do some little stitches just to hold all of this down inside, which will just help it look a bit neater once we're finished. As I say, if you were lining this, you would have the lining inside, so that would help pull it all down. But because the velvet has a tendency just to want to curl, and it's a bit springy, then it's not going to sit quite as nicely as you might want. Okay, off to the pressing.